Putin expected Ukraine to roll over in days when he launched the full-scale war in February 2022. But this was a tragic misreading of the Ukrainian people and their relationship with their leaders and system of government, which they were prepared to fight for and lay down their lives for. Instead of a small victorious war, Putin has become entangled in a quagmire that has now claimed more Russian lives than 10 years of war in Afghanistan. That war helped to accelerate the collapse of the Soviet Union. So what awaits Russia now in a much less stable situation under sanctions and potential defeat? Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce. Our material is now available on popular podcasting platforms as well, such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Konstantin von Eggert MBE is a freelance journalist, commentator, and communications consultant. He is well-known as an analyst and writer on Russian and international affairs and is a commentator at WWII. Konstantin has fulfilled many roles in a long and distinguished career, including anchor at TV Rain and Moscow bureau editor at the BBC Russian service. Konstantin was educated at Moscow University Institute of Asian and African Studies in Arabic language and studied history at Lomonosov Moscow State University. Well, thank you so much, Konstantin, for agreeing to appear on the channel. And really, I wanted to start off in an unusual way, I think, because I haven't asked any of my other speakers about their background and their family background, but I think yours is especially interesting and, of course, pertinent to the sort of terror that we see unfolding in Russia today.
Oh, that's right. Thanks for having me on the podcast or the videocast. Yes, I mean, it is, on the one hand, it's a pretty standard story for an empire. I have a mixed Russian, Polish, German, Swedish, Italian background. The Italian person was appeared in the family chronicles around about 450 years ago. He was a mercenary soldier in the army of the Polish king in the 16th century. I was born in Moscow in 1964, and I'm that rare animal from a very, very rare zoo. I'm a fourth generation Muscovite, which really kind of entitles me to probably being put in a cage and shown to people as some kind of eighth wonder of the world. Yes, it is. It gives me a very, I think, or rather it produces, and it gives me very special feelings about not only the place where I was born, but the whole Central Europe and the Baltics. Because, for example, on the one hand, I had my grandfather, who was quite a famous Soviet, Russian and Soviet, theater and cinema actor and director, carted off to the Gulag and miraculously surviving there because the camp commandant wanted to have his own theater. So he kind of pulled him out of cutting wood and made him director of the theater. On the other hand, I had my grandmother's brothers executed by NKVD in different circumstances, not to go too deep into these details. My mother and my grandmother spent the whole war in Moscow under first German bombs, then digging trenches in 1941, then working, and then their flat was completely destroyed by German bombs, and they had to go from a communal flat to a communal flat. And frankly, I was born in a communal flat. I think very few people in the UK can imagine what it means to live in a flat.
It's rare, but I lived for a year in a communal flat.
In Russia.
Yes.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, yeah,
it's quite unusual.
UK, but it's 5 families in 5 rooms sharing 1 bathroom. Yeah. Ours had no hot water, no communal kitchen, and the walls were made out of like cardboard. So whenever Aunt Masha had yet another lover in an adjacent room, I knew everything about their sex life.
And all the neighbors too, yes, everyone.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that that gives me, to some extent, a very specific and very intimate, if you wish, view of a recent and not so recent Russian history, because I'm part of the Russian community. I'm part of descendant, rather, of the German and Polish nobility. You know, it's interesting. Some of my ancestors were essentially, I think, most of them were officers. So they were traitors to the cause. Some crossed over from the Tsarist army, Imperial Army, into the Red Army. But on the other hand, I had people that in my background that revolted against the Tsarist rule in Poland, and one was actually beheaded during the partition of Poland. And very recently, I had a relative, distant Polish relative, but a relative who died in the crash of the Polish presidential plane in Smolensk in 2010, which I think is still under investigated. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think there are too many strange coincidences there not to be looked at close up. But I was lucky enough in the Soviet days, in spite of being, well, coming from an, I would say, underprivileged or non-privileged family, to get myself a good place in the university to study Arabic language and Middle East history. I spent 3 years doing national service in the, that time, Soviet Army. That was during peak perestroika days. And then after discharge, basically very soon after that, the Soviet Union collapsed. And I worked as a journalist for most of my life, maybe except for like year plus 2 years that I was in the corporate sector, working for ExxonMobil and then a freelance consultant to different FT 100 companies. So, but my life mostly was tied to Russia, of course. And in 2014, I left it, not as a political refugee, but it was a voluntary immigration to Lithuania, because I do think, and that's probably a good starting point for our story and our conversation. I think that in 2014, when I and my wife and my children voluntarily sold everything in Russia and moved to Vilnius, to Lithuania, it was a decision which was not understood by many people in my entourage. Relatives and friends and colleagues said, well, I mean, why do you do it? Yeah, of course, Putin is nasty. And of course, the Crimea was something that was extraordinary, but, you know, it's probably one-off. It's going to continue. And I said, no, I think once I've seen this hysteria, and I don't think the West media, not for lack of trying, but really you should have been inside Russian society to witness what happened in Russia in 2014. That was like, I don't know, like watching cabaret again, with hysteria, with this jingoistic, not patriotic, jingoistic sort of wave sweeping all across Russia and all over the kind of Russian minds. And I understood that at that time, two of my children, one was not even in school, another one was in school, and I thought, well, I don't want them to come back. And for me to tell them, well, you know, what things they tell you at the civics lessons and history lessons and whatever are not really true, as my mother did to me. So in the Soviet days. So we left, and alas, I have to say, today when I walk out to the street, actually I returned from doing some stuff in Vilnius, and, you know, nowadays my old Moscow Facebook passes in front of my windows, metaphorically speaking. So I think that we had quite a few turning points in the last 20 plus years of Putin's rule, but I think none is as important as 2014, the annexation, specifically 18th of March 2014, when annexation was announced. And that, I think, set Russia on a very, very dangerous and perilous course that it didn't yet run it, I think, completely.
And there seems to be another interesting breakpoint, doesn't there, in the last couple of months? Because up until this point, as you say, people could say, well, Putin, we don't necessarily like him, or this is a hybrid information autocracy, but we can live our lives, we can run our businesses, we can go to restaurants, we could do this, that, and the other. And the regime, to an extent, doesn't touch us. But then conscription began. And I think a sort of unwritten social contract between the regime and the people was broken. I mean, what was your sense when you saw those images of what amounts to basically state-sponsored abduction from the streets of, to a lesser extent, Moscow, but provincial towns especially?
Well, Jonathan, you touched upon a very interesting point. And moreover, I'll tell you that, like today, you'll find lots of people in Russia who tell you that, we always knew that, for example, Dmitry Medvedev will only stay for one term and Putin will retire. I wasn't sure about it. I thought that the smell of the Kremlin corridors, the smell of the Russian power, authority, this sort of eternal cold of Russian authoritarianism will work wonders on Dmitry Medvedev's brain, but it didn't. I mean, he turned to be quite a resilient nobody. But I think that with regard to what happened after the 24th of February, before we go into mobilization, I want to say that I never expected Putin to go into this stage 2 of the war, into this full-scale invasion. As a former officer, I can tell you that I was certain that he has his recce, his reconnaissance, his intelligence briefings. And as someone who tried to go to Ukraine every year, if possible, 2-3 years, ever since quite a long time, actually, from before the Crimea, I was absolutely certain that, unless you have a Hitler-like invasion with, scores of panzer armies streaming across the border, you have no chance of success. And that he started it was an absolute surprise to me. I thought that it was just a case of blackmailing Zelensky and the Ukrainian political class, trying to squeeze concessions out of them, trying to show Biden that he continues to run this sort of post-Soviet space no matter what. But that he's going to go for that, and in such a reckless fashion, that was a complete surprise to me. And I think that ever since the 24th of February until the 21st of September, i.e. the day mobilization was announced, for the majority of Russians, this war was this evening war on Prime News, sitting on my sofa, having a beer with my wife, Nina, something like that. I think after the 21st, it changed because mobilization touched, well, maybe the official figure is 300,000. Maybe it's more, maybe it's slightly less. It's not a lot for a country of 140 million, but it is significant. Nothing like that happened since the war in Afghanistan. And I think that it's not the end. Putin will run out of this, I'm sorry to say that, I don't want to be mean, of this cannon fodder. And he'll go back and he'll scrape, the spot for more. And this means that eventually, well, not tomorrow, but this war will start coming to more and more Russian homes. And this will cease to be war on TV, not tomorrow, not in a month, but it will eventually happen with economic difficulties also piling up. As you know, sanctions don't work overnight. Sometimes it takes a year, 2 years. But frankly, I think that eventually the reality of this war will hit those Russians who are now immune to anything but TV. It's interesting also, I think, that Putin announced on not Putin, Shoigu, his defense minister, announced these days that this mobilization is over. And you know what? In the big cities, it was pretty much unnoticed because Putin knows that he shouldn't plug Moscow and St. Petersburg, maybe Ekaterinburg, Novosibirsk, the big cities, the real metropolises, into this. Because these are people that are politically aware, these are people who know how to use YouTube, these are people that are rich enough sometimes to give a bribe or to because you always give a bribe to avoid military service in Russia or in the Soviet Union before, actually. So I think that, and it's important because I think that it needs to finally dawn on provincial Russia what this war means to them. And I think eventually it will happen.
And provincial, but also I think there's an element there of ethnic Russia, because you have a lot of the ethnic populations essentially that have been there since the Russian Empire expanded in the sort of 16th century. Maybe a lot of their identity and language and independence has been erased over the centuries, but you do see a big bulk of the cannon fodder coming from provincial ethnicities that are non-Russian.
True, but at the same time, I think that we have a lot of these conversations here in Central Europe about, the oppressive nature of the ethnically oppressive nature of the current Russian regime. Well, look, I traveled before this 24th of the fateful date, 24th of February. I traveled in Russia because, as I said, I was a voluntary emigre. My work with WWII, the German BBC, was very much connected to working with Russian audiences. And so I traveled quite a lot. And I did, over my lifetime, travel quite a lot in Russia, including provincial Russian. And I think that there's a misperception about this kind of the sharpness of ethnic problems. I would say that there are more problems between, or used to be at least, between, let us say, the guest workers, the immigrants from Central Asia, from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, than between, let's say, the Russians and the Tatars in Russia. There is probably one exception, and that is North Caucasus, Chechnya, Ingushetia, Dagestan, which were actually conquered on the current Russian territory. This is the territory that was conquered by the Tsars. It was the most recently conquered, I would say, in the 1850s and 60s. However, first of all, there are too many contradictions between these ethnicities, between themselves. So in a sense, some of them, and I'm not calling for kind of an imperial power, but some of them actually want someone to be like an arbiter from above. That's one. Secondly, after the Chechnya war, Putin is pouring enormous money into, well, those regions that can rebel. I mean, it doesn't mean that this money spreads across the population. I mean, poor Ingush or poor Chechens are as poor as poor people in Voronezh or in Siberia. But generally, the elites are kept very, very well fed by the Russian, by the Kremlin. Chechnya exists in a de facto confederal union with Russia. But that means that they will be the last to say we actually want to leave. And also, let me remind you, Russia, and it's, frankly, I think you can believe these polls more or less in this kind of polling data from official and independent Russian pollsters. 80% of the population say they are Russian. It doesn't mean they are ethnically. You don't measure blood, but they recognize themselves as Russian. They identify as Russian. This is essentially mono-ethnic states in many ways. And the fact that they kind of scrape, they import into this meat grinder so many people from, let's say, places like Buryatia or Tiva in Siberia, which are populated by a kind of people that are related, let's say, to the Mongols and Chinese to some extent. It's rather a testimony not of Putin deciding to suddenly eliminate people from Tiva. They are, in terms of numbers, they are very insignificant for elections, or they're not particularly rebellious. It's because these are extremely poor regions with very high levels of alcoholism, unemployment. And that's why people are easily attracted into this kind of easy money, into earning easy money. By these kind of calls to join the army, and that's why they die disproportionately, of course. But I think that I wouldn't say it's a specific policy of kind of Russification, if you wish. It's, I think, it has more to do with social economic conditions than with ethnicities. But yes, that also means, and that's a product of this war, that disproportionate rate of death, of disappearance among those small peoples. Means there will be fewer of them. That means there will be, percentage-wise, more Russians. So Russia becomes even more mono-ethnic, if you wish, at least, as I said, in terms of self-identification.
And to an extent, it's I think you saying the word "it's a testament to" makes it sound far more positive than it is, but it's a testament to the success of Soviet brainwashing over many decades, isn't it? That it's actually erased these distinct identities from history.
Yes, yes. Those people who could have been, or were actually, leaders of, the ethnic and national revival in some of those areas were either eliminated by the Bolsheviks, by the communists, or some of them were incorporated into the Soviet system. Those who were susceptible to essential bribery were made this sort of people's artists of the Tatar Soviet, Autonomous Soviet Republic, or whatever. By the way, that meant, of course, that some of them really had wonderful careers. Some of them were not completely devoid of talent. But you could be a Tatar or a Chechen only within certain parameters. And I think that what it meant is that, to a large extent, this policy of Russification was successful in many areas of the former Soviet Union, and especially the current territory of the Russian Federation. It's interesting because, Jonathan, you touched upon one of the debates that happened, especially in the 1990s, when the war in Chechnya was launched by the Kremlin in 1994. And that is, do we really consider that the breakup of the Soviet Union, which was constituted of 15 republics, could stop with those 15 republics becoming independent states? Because inside those republics, there were other republics which were called autonomous republics. And for example, the Chechens said, yes, we want to be independent. If the Soviet Union is going, why should we stick? We don't want to stick with Russia. And I think that this question was resolved, quote unquote, by Boris Yeltsin, who launched this brutal war, and then resolved finally by Putin, who in fact understood that he can't conquer Chechnya. And now all this money that pours into Ramzan Kadyrov's pocket is effectively a Russian contribution. But you can't say it in Russia. You can't say it. Putin was already defeated once. Now he's being defeated by Ukrainians, but he was defeated by the Chechens. And everyone pretends it doesn't happen. It's like people in Moscow pretending that there is no war. Old man, I have this exhibition opening tomorrow. Would you come? We'll drink, of course, Abkhaz wine instead of the French wine or something like that. And we'll have Serbian cheese instead of French cheese. But we'll pretend that life goes on. This type of thing happening even among intellectuals who know everything about what goes on. I think that to some extent, this is still the issue of Chechnya. And to finish on that, or at least to finish answering your question, I know I have very long answers, but I think that once Putin disappears from the scene, which he will, and once and if Russia becomes at least a relatively free state, at least with some degree of freedom and accountability during elections, I'm absolutely certain that the moment a new Russian Duma is elected, which will consist, by the way, not only of wonderful Democrats, Lech Walesa or Nelson Mandela style, there'll be some nasty people there too if you have free elections. And someone will stand up, some new MP will stand up and say, ladies and gentlemen of the chamber, I come from whatever, Omsk, and I want to ask you why the Chechen Republic is getting 95% of its budget directly as a federal transfer from the treasury. My good electorate from a village of New River, 300 kilometers from Omsk, they also want this kind of life. They don't want to pay any taxes, or rather they may pay taxes if 85% to 95% of their budget is phoned by Moscow. And I'm sure it will be a debate. There will be a debate about, is a Russian Federation a real federation? And frankly speaking, it's very strange, but I think that in the 1990s, people that defended the Chechens were the Russian Democrats, who were saying, well, they shouldn't kill people, which is absolutely normal because they are, well, you shouldn't try to conquer them, should set them free, should determine their own life and so forth. And you know, the Russian uber patriots were saying, and you remember the 90s, they were saying, oh no, not a single square inch of Russian soil will ever be expended like it was in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Now the roles are completely reversed because the Russian nationalists, if there's ever a possibility of free debate in Russia, will be saying, we should say goodbye to Chechnya, let them go, let's fence them off. We don't need these people. And it will be the human rights defenders, NGOs, the Russian liberals, you call them whatever name you want to call them, will be saying, no, you can't push people out of the country if they don't want to go. So Russia is the land of historical paradox.
I mean, it's an interesting concept, though. I mean, we're talking here about changes to society, changes in the structure of first the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation, almost based on partly accidents, also based to an extent on envy, because I remember hearing a lot of people in the 90s complaining about the ex-Soviet states. Why are they so well off? Why did they get all the best stuff when it was our empire, etc.? And this is, you've given an echo of that very same feeling. And to an extent, I know this isn't very geopolitically sophisticated, but the invasion of Ukraine and the widespread support for it can't just, I think, be explained by propaganda alone. There's also that green-eyed monster, zavist, or envy, plays a significant part.
Yes, envy and inferiority complexes, of course. And I do agree. I think that explaining it away by propaganda just simplifies it to an extent that you'll just very soon be forced to answer questions to which there are no answers because you don't see the whole of the picture. Of course, it is envy, and I think with regard to Ukrainians, it is a very specific type of envy and hatred. Because Ukrainians are seen really as a nation pretty much similar to the Russians. And the Russians live not only under Putin, under the Soviet Union, under the Tsars. Remember, it's only 161 years since serfdom was abolished in Russia. And the practice of just buying and selling people and killing them, if you want, was terminated. So Russians who look at Ukraine and see that Ukraine, they have elections, they regularly rebel against their authorities, while the Russians at best petition them. They feel this inferiority. I think it's very deep and said, why are they not like us? Why don't they put up with oppression and with the authorities lording it over them?
Corruption.
Why corruption? And why we put up with that and these people decide not to? Something must be wrong. They should be like us. Instead of saying we should follow their example, they say, wow, if they continue like that, it's going to be a constant reminder to me who I am. So it's hatred of the other because the other dared to do something very differently. And I have to say that it was completely underappreciated, both in Russia and in the West, the way Ukraine developed after 1991. I remember having lunch in London with a very good friend of mine, James Sher. He's a very famous British researcher and consultant to the British government. He was one of the first Western specialists on Ukraine in the 90s. And I remember we had this lunch, and it was 2000, 2001, something like that. And I voiced this very popular, at that time it was a very popular opinion that, well, Ukraine is like a mafia state. It's completely controlled by the oligarchs. It's just a smaller sized version of Russia in terms of its political system. I understood that the ethnicity is completely different, but political system is getting the same. It's just fewer people, less rich oligarchs, and no nuclear weapons. That's it. Otherwise, the system is getting the same. And I remember James Scher telling me, Kostya, you're wrong. So, why? Well, you see, the main event that makes Ukraine different from Russia is that in 1994, the first president of Ukraine and its last Communist Party chief, Leonid Makarovich Kravchuk, who died this year, lost an election to another Soviet-era bureaucrat by the name of Leonid Kuchma. And what he did, he peacefully transferred power, gave up his presidential office, and became just a regular MP in the Verkhovna Rada, in the Ukrainian parliament. He said, this was a turning point for Ukraine because it experienced, okay, it's a bit dirty, yes, there is corruption, there are oligarchs, but it experienced democracy. And you know, literally, since 1991, Ukraine had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 presidents. Russia had only, in fact, 2, if we don't consider Medvedev to be a serious. Okay, 3.
You could even argue, I mean, Yeltsin didn't peacefully transfer power, in effect, not in a democratic way that you've just described.
Peacefully, but I think undemocratic. Yeah.
Yeah. Or at least he put in place a mafia warlord, essentially, who could then protect his interests.
Yes.
So that's not a traditional transfer of power.
And yes, I think, and by the way, Jonathan, you're right. Not even peacefully, to some extent. And I'm no big hater of Boris Yeltsin. He was who he was, and he did what he could. But I think that you're right. If you look at the fact that the second war in Chechnya was launched as a kind of revenge war, exactly before or during the time Putin became the prime minister. Putin became the war prime minister, 9th of August, 1999. I think you're right. It wasn't even peaceful, for that matter, because all this thing was designed to help Putin become Yeltsin's successor. So yes, Russia did not experience a peaceful transfer of power because, again, Medvedev was boxed in and could do nothing. Actually, if he rebelled, if he said, I don't care what happens to the president, but I'm against it, he would have been, a local hero, but he isn't. He's now just
and probably fallen out of a window shortly afterwards.
So what do you say?
Probably fallen out of a window shortly afterwards, or
yes, yes, or drinking the same tea that Mr. Litvinenko drank in London in 2006. Yes,
yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask as well, because there's an interesting experience of the 90s, which has a kind of horrific echo for me, watching conscription unfold. But I wanted to really link it to your experience in being in the Russian armed forces, and that was in the first Chechen War. I remember seeing people being press ganged into the army when they closed the exits of the underground stations in St. Petersburg, and then they check everyone's papers on the escalators. There was no way of escape. No new trains would come in. And it was terrifying, seeing mostly poor young men. They, as you say, they wouldn't take people from wealthier families who had the right documentation. But seeing those sort of echoes several years later, I mean, could you talk about your experience of the army and why what seems to be unfolding, the sort of defeats, the poor equipment, the poor discipline, the fairly toxic hierarchy? I mean, do you see echoes of the Soviet experience in the army to the current Russian army?
Yes, I was lucky to serve as an officer after the university because, as you know, Jonathan, some Russian universities and higher education colleges, they had this military training because the Soviet Union was completely militarized society. So you had military training in school. So we all knew how to handle a Kalashnikov by the age of 17, because you were supposed to be conscripted into the army at the age of 18. But for many, many people, there were exceptions, including those who got a place at certain institutions of higher learning, including the Moscow University where I studied. And at the same time, you had military training during your college days, and you graduated as an officer. So if you went to the same Moscow Aviation Institute, you became a technician or an aviation engineer, Air Force engineer. I studied Arabic language, so I became a military interpreter, translator. And I was sent to a Soviet military mission in Yemen, where I spent 3 years doing my national service and progressing from second lieutenant to first lieutenant. But that's normal in the army, that you just get this extra star automatically. And I know people will say, well, you're with the GRU or whatever. No, I wasn't, but it doesn't matter. I'm not going to prove it here. But what I would say is that I served among the officers, of course, no soldiers there. It was officers that were servicing and teaching the Yemenis how to handle Soviet, already by that time, obsolete weapons. And things I heard from all these people that were coming from different parts of the former Soviet Union, what I saw in our advisor group, how relations were constructed, how subordination worked. That gave me that gave me ample outlook on the state of the Soviet army. And I would say what I think survives. It's not the issue of weaponry, although weaponry is important because really classy weaponry is only developed, I think, generally by private interest. Or in, say, the Chinese case, you have to have major investments, enormous investments, complemented by basically a situation which working for these organizations, like it was in the Soviet Union, being a nuclear physicist was great because you were part of the elite that was guaranteed a certain lifestyle. So I think the same happens probably to Chinese engineers that work on their whatever silkworm missiles. But generally, I think you don't get advanced weaponry in a society, in a country that is backward, and Soviet technology was backward already. That's number one. Number two, in terms of the way the army functioned, the way relations, even between officers, were structured, it was very clear that you were essentially, I'll go probably too far, but if you're of junior rank, you're like a slave to probably, if not the next rank, then to the rank slightly above, the next after.
I don't think that's going too far. I've heard a lot of anecdotal stories describe it exactly in that way.
And for example, I was in a very specific position in which I could talk back to, say, the colonel who headed my advisory group, because I was a link between these people and the Yemeni army and the Yemeni procurement people and so on and so forth that would repair our jeeps. I was indispensable. And also, I was not inside the system. Everyone knew I'm going to leave the moment my last day, I'm going to demob the moment my last day arrives. And they knew that I'm independent in this respect. So I could talk back to the colonel, I could do whatever. I don't say I wasn't disciplined or I was rude, but I didn't feel any dependence. I didn't feel any fear. For the rest of them, it was built on fear. Because you know what? Even if you're lucky to go and serve abroad, if you don't kind of work towards, to put it mildly, your major or your colonel, whoever is your direct superior, after you finish your mission, he'll write a recommendation to general staff. And depending on how he describes you, he'll either go to, let us say, that's the Soviet Union. Okay, you go to Kiev, which was very prestigious. Or you go to some hellhole, again, 200 kilometers from Orenburg. And this is something that was an extremely important thing, because there was no way to appeal it. There was no way to in any way counter it, unless you had what, as you know, in Russian is called blat, i.e., an acquaintance of an acquaintance who works on the general staff and who say, oh, no, stop this lesson. Colonel Ivanov, or rather Captain Sidorov, wouldn't go to a village 200 kilometers from Orenburg. He'll go, okay, probably not to Kiev, but he'll go to Sverdlovsk, which is now Ekaterinburg. Another thing, bribery. Everyone was supposed to bring not just a packet of Yemeni coffee to the general staff, video recorders, loads of stuff. Moreover, and I heard a lot of these stories really in the Soviet time, that was very spread, where the junior officer would be ordered, oh yeah, drive my wife to the shop, or drive my mother-in-law to the train station. And that was supposed to be an order, although it's just officially a request.
Help build my dacha. I mean, in the 90s, that was one where...
And yes, and that's what I want to touch upon.
Yes.
Corruption. Stories of corruption were absolutely everywhere. In any, you would sit down to drink a vodka and people say, oh yeah, I remember we were sent whatever 3 tons of sheet metal to build hangars for our planes or whatever, for our power generators. And suddenly all of our officers' dachas were covered with this sheet metal, and the generators remained in the open space under the influence of elements. So I think that all this remained. And also an important thing, we didn't have any NCOs there, we couldn't. But essentially, the Russian army, the Soviet army, and to a large extent the Russian army still, is built on essentially the officer taking full control and full responsibility for minutiae of the life of his whatever, platoon, company, whatever. He doesn't have time to think about how his company will operate, for example, in such and such circumstances. He has to be very much informed, and he has to take action on a soldier's torn boot or something. Again, I'm slightly exaggerating, but the amount of detail, the amount of paperwork is staggering. It shifted a little bit since in the wake of the invasion of Georgia, Putin decided to go for an all-professional army. And there are slightly more sergeants that can do stuff the officers were supposed to do even until 2000 something. But it's still not the army of sergeants. To be a sergeant is not prestigious in any way. And I think that it's still an army where officers are overloaded. It's still an army where officers are not very well educated, frankly speaking. And it's very important. It's still an army in which the officers are not taught to think independently. By the way, the same with the Russian foreign ministry, where you don't argue with your head of political section or with your consul or with your ambassador. It's this lack of, to and froing. It's this lack of give and take that characterizes it. I covered the Balkans War.
It's a vertical, as I've heard it described.
I look at the British forces. I think the British forces are the best forces in the world. Not because of high tech, although there's enough high tech there, frankly speaking. It's because of a relationship between men and relationship between officers and men. On the one hand, that these people are going to die, not only for king and country, but probably for their colonel. On the other hand, and it's very clear, the authority is very clear. But on the other hand, it's never an authority of a landlord who orders peasantry around. And this is such a stark difference with the Soviet and to a large extent, the Russian army. And I think, Jonathan, that everything you needed to know about it. I didn't have to go into this long exposés of my Lawrence of Arabia light adventures in the Yemen. But look at what happened in Bucha, Irpin, and other Ukrainian towns and villages that were basically erased. You look at these rapes, plunder, loot, killings. It couldn't happen if the officers did not say this is allowed to happen. You have manuals, like the Russian army still has service manuals. They have to act according to the manual. You're not supposed to break into civilians' houses. You're not supposed to rape girls or men or whoever, dogs. Things they did is crazy. It's because they knew. They were either ordered to do it, or Comrade Captain told them, "Oh yeah, don't worry about it. It's all right."
A strategy. It's a feature, not a bug.
And it's a feature. You can't do it unless in this pyramid. The Russian army is very much pyramid. Any army is a pyramid, but Russian army is a pyramid with very sharp edges. You can't do it unless actually the commander-in-chief says it's fine. Go on. You wouldn't find written orders probably that will specifically state, go and rape every single woman in that or this village or town. No. Or go and lift the proverbial washing machines from the Ukrainians' homes and send them to the proverbial Orient Bowl. No. But, Russian army, as a lot of Russian society, works on understandings. And of course, if this was happening in such massive way, it is the best illustration, Jonathan, on what the Russian army is.
Absolutely. And those who are not observed to go along with that system, of course, they themselves will come under suspicion if their behavior in some way didn't support what clearly were unwritten orders.
Certainly, it's like corruption. People go into a ministry in Russia, and they probably even think, okay, yeah, I'll work there for a few years, and then I'll move on. Then I'll probably get to kind of create a private business, and I'm not going to steal anything. But once you get into the system, the corruption is one of the conditions of its existence, because Russia is essentially run, and I said it many times on the BBC and wherever. Russia is run very simply. It's run by two tools. In the left hand, it's corruption. In the right hand, Putin brandishes fear. It's not very original. You can go and read about it in Russian classics in the 19th century, but it is very effective. And in a completely demoralized and atomized society that Russia is today, to wield these tools is easier than it is in a more coherent, even in some way, in a Soviet society, and I'm no big fan of communists, full disclosure, but in the Soviet society there were perceived to be certain common values, enforced, but they were there. If you did something, you could lose your party membership, for example. Not anymore.
And even rules between adversaries. So there were unwritten rules between the US and the USSR. You would compete in certain areas, not in others.
Yes, that's why it was very recently I attended a conference in Vilnius, actually, where someone said, a younger Russian said, alas, this is the new Cold War leadership, like the Soviet leadership was in the Cold War. I said, oh, there's a huge difference between the Soviet leadership of, say my age, Brezhnev, Andropov, and people like that, and Putin and his gang. Brezhnev and Andropov and the rest of them, or this kind of Politburo startsi, the old men of the Politburo, they were not democratically elected politicians. Some of them were bastards, most of them were bastards, of course. But frankly, they were politicians who acted upon the national interests of the Soviet Union the way those interests were formulated by them. They were not really a mafia out of Mario Puzo's novel. The difference with Putin's leadership is striking. Putin and Sechin and Shoigu and Lavrov and the rest of this crew, they act upon the national interests of Russia as they see them. The problem is that because these people also happen to own Russia wholesale, and because these people essentially lord it in a much more direct way than the late Soviet system did, because the Soviet system was a certain, unofficial separation of powers. I mean, for example, the KGB was subordinated to the Council of Ministers, not to the party. That was a fallout from Stalin's days. But these people run Russia, own it, and that means that national interest and private interest, personal interest, is completely coincides in their heads. They don't see a difference. And because of that, it's a survivor, it's a regime that survives every day. And that means a completely different quality of decision-making and completely different attitude towards decision-making. So I think that, I don't think that Putin will go for nuking Ukraine or even exploding a test device somewhere, because he knows, I'm pretty sure he's been warned already what are going to be the consequences. But do not expect Cold War rationality and rules from that. I think that this is the most dangerous thing, is that you don't know what they're going to do. And mitigating that is, of course, a staggering incompetence of this system. And the invasion itself, as we discussed at the beginning, is great proof of that. But it is not the Soviet Union. It's much more unpredictable. And actually, the problem is, I think, unpredictability is seen by Putin as one of the very few tools he really possesses.
That's it. It's similar to Stalin as well. Part of the terror lies in not knowing who is going to be victim and what's going to happen next. Now, I know it's a Saturday afternoon, and I know you've got things to do. I've got one more question.
If I may, I think it was a very, very sharp observation, Jonathan. The randomness of terror is what made the Bolshevik regime, especially under Stalin, different from the Nazi regime. There's this, I think he's still alive, a Dutch historian by the name of Geert Mak. And he wrote this very thick volume called In Europe, around about the millennium, when such books were very popular. And he was the first Westerner whom I heard, or rather I read his book, and he observed that that was a major difference between Stalin's Soviet Union, let's say Moscow 1937 and Berlin 1937. In Hitler's Germany, if you were not a Jew, a Freemason, a communist, a Sinti and Roma, a Catholic activist, and you didn't listen to the BBC German service broadcasts at full blast in your flat, you could have counted on being safe, by no means guaranteed, but the calculation was reasonable. In Stalin's Russia, you couldn't. You could have been a nobleman, like some of my relatives, and survive. And you could have been an old party member, or just a worker, and be put to the wall. And that creates a situation in which has a very long-lasting impact on the national psyche. And this fear is, I mean, I don't want to sound like some kind of crazy guru, but it's nearly genetic.
Certainly passed down through generations, even if it's not explicit.
Yes. My mother who saw her father arrested in front of her eyes during my grandmother's birth. She had this fear until the very end, and by the way, she hated Putin from day one. And once I remember coming back home, and she was quite weak when she lived with us a few months before her death, and I came back late from, I've got some kind of party. And I see that a door to her room is ajar, and she's listening to radio, to Echo Moskvy, actually. And I come in and I say, Mama, you should have gone to sleep. She says, no, until you're home, I'm not going to go to sleep. I said, look, I am whatever I was at the time, 40 plus, I'm married, I have children, I'm responsible, I'm not an alcoholic, I'm not a drug addict. Even if I drink something, I'm going to grab a cab and go back safely. I'm a reasonable man. And you know that it's a weight on me to know that you're sitting there sleepless, waiting for me. I said, I know, and I'm very sorry about it. But you know what? Я только спокойно, I'm only calm when you are this side of the door or that side of the border. And that was, to me, and still is, a definition what's wrong with the Soviet legacy.
Absolutely. That terror doesn't quite go away. I had a very different, but I had a similar raging argument with my father about the role of Finland in the Second World War. And I had a certain sympathy for the Finns siding with the Nazis to preserve their independence. Now, my grandmother fled Austria in 1938. And so my father didn't really see the point there. But my point was that stuck between two tyrannies, which are threatening to wipe you out. One is an industrialized tyranny, which, as you said, doesn't, it's predictable in its tyranny. The other is an agrarian tyranny that harks back to something like, the pharaohs of Egypt. It's something that is so alien to you, which you're going to side with. Well, for the Finns, you go with the industrial one, the one that you see as a higher form of development, less capricious.
Certainly, and in the last, probably 10 years of his life, I was very friendly with the late King Michael of Romania and Queen Anne. They took a liking to me, and we conversed very frequently. And learning about Romania between the wars, which was also pretty anti-Semitic, it wasn't a nice regime, and the king was a figurehead until in 1944 he overthrew Antonescu, the real ruler of Romania. And I think that it came across very clearly when he talked about it, that the unpredictable barbarism of Bolshevism was definitely produced a bigger fear than this kind of orderly, rational, seemingly rational. It was, as irrational, but the image was a much more rational Hitler tyranny. And yes, and that's why we talk about it, all this kind of regime in Central Europe, Horthy and whatever, the Sanation regime in Poland, Pilsudski, their main enemy was always Bolshevism, because they were completely shocked by it. And today, I'm not equating. I'm not saying that Hitler was anyway better. What I want to say is that was a historical factor at the time, actually in the Baltic states too, where the communists were considered to be the main problem internally, and not for nothing. The Commentator existed. They spread their ideas, their terror, their money across the world. So I think that yes, it is a story that I think to some extent still is not completely told.
And the behavior is perhaps less to do with communism, more to do with, goodness, the Mongol horde and deep historic behaviors that go back to a previous era of our history of migratory tribes. It's this eternal Russian question. Yeah,
where did it all go wrong? And many people go back to the Mongol invasion because before that looked a bit like a kind of more or less normal medieval state of affairs,
or look to it with pride, like Dugin and
as in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, something like that.
Yeah, or look to it as a model for future development, as Dugin and Gumilev do, unfortunately, which has been quoting.
Yeah.
My very last question, because I know you need to have some lunch and it's late on a Saturday. You've generously given up your time. But the last question here really is, you've talked about terror, you've talked about the regimes, but we also see, Lukashenko, and we see Yanukovych, and we see Iran. We see places where you equally have a kind of Siloviki class, so you have terror and you have barbarism and you have all the stuff we've been talking about, but the reaction of peoples is different. In Belarus, there was a lot more resistance. Ultimately, it was unsuccessful. In Iran, we're seeing extraordinary spirited resistance. And in Ukraine, actually successfully resisting an attempt to turn back the clock and create a new kleptocracy. And the question, because I know you've been asked a million times in Western media, why don't Russians rebel? And I think that's quite a trite, ignorant question. But I think there's something about the sort of fight or flight that goes deeper. And in Russia, you see the reaction to tyranny as being, as many of your acquaintances and people I know as well, just getting out of the country. And you can understand it on an individual level or even the protection of your families. But to me, it also portrays a sense that they don't feel they have any ownership of the country they live in, any ownership of the system, whereas people are willing to risk their lives in Ukraine and Iran, despite terror, because perhaps they still feel they own a part of its future.
Yes, I think so. I think you're right. And I think that Russian society is, and we mentioned that, is very individualistic, and not individualistic in this, libertarian Ayn Rand sense of the word. It's individualistic. It's individualistic in a very weak sense of the word. It's
classless, atomized,
of atomized, weak individuals that are always only for themselves. And frankly, I'm being part of this nation. Also, like that, I decided to not to fight, but I decided on a flight.
Mm.
Yes, I do produce words that work against Putin, but I know I didn't go to jail.
Oh, but you left at a critical period.
Yes,
and made a moral judgment. That, to an extent, is better than just fleeing.
Maybe, but I think that also, well, comparisons with Iran are not completely justified because Iranians have a much stronger sense of nationhood. It's a 2,500 years old statehood. Also, it's a much younger country. This kind of population growth and ended in Iran, as far as I know, but there's still enough young people for decades.
Yes,
and young countries are ignited much better because there are more people that feel that there is no future. Russia is an old country with very bad demographics, and that has its role too. Also, it's an imperial mindset, which is, and that's a different imperial mindset from the British one, for example. Britain was France also was an overseas empire. So yes, it was bad to lose Zanzibar, but in the end, you could sail from it and forget that it ever existed. You can't forget about the existence of Kazakhstan or Ukraine. They're still there, right across the border. And I think that this adds to this feeling that the empire is everything. And then it's propaganda. It's part of it. It's not the whole of the problem, but it's propaganda too. And also, I think it's the main problem for me. I don't know whether you will agree, someone who speaks Russian and have been to Russia. In the end, all this history led to a nation of people that are completely devoid of self-respect. And once you do not respect yourself, I don't mean admire, respect, you don't respect others. And that creates a situation in which it's very easy to manipulate you. And it's very easy to force you to do completely immoral things.
And my simple answer when people ask how can Russians do these things to Ukrainians is that easily, because they do it to each other and have done.
It's a very violent society.
It has. And I kind of also get a sense, having met, I know that generation has completely died out, but having met people who were the children of emigres during the revolution, and obviously through reading, I started reading diaries of people at the time, which I found much more interesting in some ways than an analytical history, because it gives you a sense that actually Russia was a different place. It had different dynamics. It had people who were prepared to resist. It had a sense of classes, and it had a much more politically active or evolving social sphere in, say, 1912 than it does now. And I think that's...
I agree. I think that also, to some extent, the Tsarist regime was much more lenient. Yes. If, for example, I look at some of the files of some of my relatives that were in Tsarist jails for, say, pro-Polish propaganda, or some for social democratic propaganda, and some for social democratic Polish propaganda too. And I mean, it doesn't compare.
No,
to,
I mean, I believe the figure,
and
yeah.
And one important thing is that you mentioned it. Yes, Russia was very, very, very active politically, especially since 1905, since the first revolution.
Yes,
and the Tsar's manifesto of 17th of October 1905, which essentially ushered in the era of not exactly constitutional monarchy, but preparation for constitutional monarchy. If it wasn't for the catastrophe of the Great War, then I think maybe it would have evolved into something else.
I agree, yeah.
Maybe. I mean, Nicholas II wasn't a very talented ruler, but maybe if it wasn't for the war and for this jingoism, this idea that, oh, we're going to, rip them apart, could have been a different Russia. But
very much so. I think it's that sense of loss and a potential history that could have been that is actually also underpinning and driving the extreme nationalism we see. So it's a toxic narrative, very much like the Weimar narrative of loss and betrayal, and then that's playing out at the same time.
Yeah, I agree. Although one of the Russian opposition activists now in exile, an intellectual, a few weeks ago on Facebook, he wrote, "Look, we're all talking about, this being a 39 or 1941, 1940 moment, revenge. Well, like creating parallels between Putin and Hitler." And he asked this man, he is a professor in Prague, he said, and what if Putin is actually Kaiser Wilhelm and the real Weimar and the real Hitler?
Still to come.
Still way off. Of course, history doesn't repeat itself. No, but that's an interesting proposition. I don't think it's true, frankly. I don't think Russia will sustain itself. But, you can always theorize.
And it points towards an inherent unpredictability and the fact that things could get even worse than they currently are, which is I guess a realistic place to end on. But I really appreciate speaking to you today. It's been absolutely fantastic, very, very stimulating, and hopefully perhaps get the chance to speak again as events are rapidly unfolding.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I enjoyed your insights because it was very much speaking to a mind that is very much piercing and penetrating Russian reality, like very few Western minds I know, and believe me, I know quite a few. So thanks a million for having me, and I wish you success.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you.